Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Anyegolu. Now, if you ask anyone why Nigeria appears to have performed poorly in the past 60 years or so, they're likely to attribute it to corruption, ethnic rivalries, religious divisions, and poor leadership. Well, a new book makes all those arguments and more. It challenges those accepted reasons for Nigeria's underdevelopment, arguing that at the heart of it is Nigeria's democracy, which it says is in reverse gear, full of missteps and regrets. The book groups its arguments into 4 sections: democratic imperatives, domestic development challenges, foreign policy dimensions, and leadership and governance. And it seems to be calling for one big thing: the restructuring of Nigeria for what the author says is national cohesion and good governance. And he's set out to show a close link between Nigeria's multiple development challenges, which are quite simply unsustainable and will leave the country inherently prone to instability. Sounds jolly interesting, doesn't it? Well, the author of that book, Waning Strength of Government, Essays on Nigeria's Governance, is Oseloka Obaze, former PDP governorship candidate in Anambra State in the 2017 elections. He's also former secretary of the state government of Anambra State and a former member of the Nigerian diplomatic service. And he joins me now in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for joining us.
Thank you, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here again.
Tell us more about this book and why you decided to write it.
Well, first and foremost, I'm a student of politics and public policy. I've also been privileged to serve in the federal government, the Shagari administration, Buhari administration, and the Babangida administration, while in the foreign service. And I've also served under 4 secretary generals at the United Nations before coming home to serve under 2 governors in Anambra State. And basically, my take is that I need to add value, drawing on my broad experience, some good, some bad, in terms of policy and governance, and to see where things are not working optimally. The least we can do in terms of adding value is to do the SWOT analysis and speak truth to power in terms of policy formulation, policy implementation, and in actually policy assessment.
And just explain that SWOT. That's an acronym, isn't it?
Yes. The strength, the weaknesses, and the threats. Of course, opportunities and threats. It's an acronym. What are the strengths? What are the weaknesses of government and their policies? What are the weaknesses? What are the opportunities? Both those taken and the missed opportunities, and then the threats to the government or to those policies, and being able to put that in perspective. Of course, it's subjective based on my own experience, but also referenced to every policy that has been in place, and hoping that somebody would read it and begin to appreciate that there's certain things that are not being done the way they ought to do. Of course, the bottom line is that we need to engage ourselves in dialogue, and we need to speak to the government.
But you know, the thing about it is that obviously listening to you, you're a very articulate person, and I mean, it's always interesting hearing the way that you sort of conceptualize and articulate things. But somebody would say that those are things that are not necessarily new. I mean, what's the central argument that you make about the waning strength of government? What's the critical analysis there that'll make us all wake up?
Statutorily, what is the responsibility of government? Communities have existed hitherto without government, but there were governance models within the ethnic communities, the traditional communities. Now, when you bring in the formal governance structure like we have them, whether it's democratic, socialist, or what, there are certain parameters that are expected to be met. We have elected, we've shifted away from the parliamentary system to the presidential system. And is it working optimally for Nigerians? The answer is no. What are the fundamentals of governance? The first is responsibility to protect. Is the government of the day at the state level, at the federal level, protecting Nigerians at the optimal level? The answer is no. What are the other responsibilities? Catering for the catering for the hierarchy of needs: housing, water, electricity, healthcare delivery. Are we delivering those optimally? The answer is no. So what has gone wrong? What has gone wrong is that we have policies that are not being properly implemented and not being properly evaluated. And we are not holding the government's to the fire to say, do what you're supposed to do. Forget the partisan politics. Government has a responsibility. Once you've been elected, you have a responsibility not to cater just for your party, but to cater to all Nigerians, regardless of their ethnicity, regardless of their state of origin.
Right, and you assert in the book that democracy is under assault in Nigeria. Tell us why you think that is the case.
Democracy is not just under assault in Nigeria, it's under assault globally. There are pockets.
Yeah, you did mention Africa as well.
And Africa particularly. Look at what happened to Guinea recently. That ought not to have happened. But in as much as we condemn what happened to Guinea, we must also condemn the fact that Condé created the opportunity for the coup d'etat by exceeding his mandate. And
jailing all those who protested against it.
They ought to be members of the intelligentsia in Guinea who ought to have said to him, no,
they did, and they were locked up.
Well, it shouldn't end that. Don't forget, it's on record that at the end of the Obasanjo administration, we also had a similar situation. The issue, was there going to be a third term or not? And some people rose courageously against that. He might not have liked it, but we know that the result was that there was continuity and respect for the constitution.
But I think the threat in Guinea is much more profound than the threat in Nigeria. I mean, that there's a certain level of freedom, I think, that you have in a country like Nigeria through the certain arms of government, the National Assembly, who were the people who actually stood up quite firmly against a third term, whereas in Guinea you don't have that kind of.
The threat of any nature is progressive. It starts quite in a very oblique manner, and if unchallenged, it progresses to the point where it becomes irreversible. That's what has happened in Guinea. Perhaps if they had started earlier to say, Mr. President or Mr. Prime Minister, this is not going to stand, we're not going to tolerate it. If you're going to do this, you're on your own. Perhaps it might have done on President Conte not to go that route. But here, of course, we have a larger attentive public. We have a
much more robust
press, opposition.
Although you criticize the press in your book as well.
Well, duly and rightly so. No apologies served, because we've seen more vibrant press here that does not kowtow to the government of the day. Here, there's a big question mark to that.
Yeah, so in terms of comparison, it's better here than there, but it still leaves a lot to be desired.
Precisely. I think that is the apt way to put it.
But you also assert that the focus of the book is not the strength of government in a democratic Nigeria, but rather the departure from that value which has manifested in the waning strength of government. I'm not entirely sure I understand what you mean there.
Well,
you know, you use a lot of big words. And,
I write for intellectuals like yourself and for the academics.
I wouldn't call myself an intellectual.
Well, you can be in denial.
I'm quite pedestrian when it comes
Charles,
to intellectual stuff.
I know your pedigree. I know your antecedents. I know where you went to school.
But let's
focus on that. No, this is the point. The strength of government could be taken for granted. We know what government is all about in a democracy. It's expected that government must function in certain areas in the interest of the national population. What is the mission of the population? The pursuit of happiness, social justice, peace and security. Now, when government that is supposed to provide security is not doing that,
there's a problem.
There's a problem.
Okay, hold that thought.
That's a winning strength.
Hold that thought. I'm going to come back and we'll continue from there.
Very well.
You're watching The Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with Oseloka Obaze, author of a new book about the challenges confronting Nigeria in the area of policy and governance. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview, where we speak to the newsmakers as well as ordinary people doing extraordinary things around the world and featuring the voices at the heart of the stories. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, my special guest today, Oseloka Obaze, is a former PDP governorship candidate in Anambra State in the 2017 elections. He's also a former Secretary of State to the government of Anambra State and former staff of the United Nations as well as the Nigerian Diplomatic Service. He's written several books, his latest, titled Waning Strength of Government, Essays on Nigeria's Governance, weighs in on the challenges confronting Nigeria in the area of policy and governance. After more than 60 years of independence, the country is still burdened with weak institutions, and this has had profound implications for Nigeria. So, as a result, and perhaps not surprisingly, democracy, he says, faces a big test in Nigeria. And the author, politician, and former diplomat, Oseloka Obaze, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us.
Thank you again.
And before we went on a break, you were talking to us about the one of the focuses of your book, which is not the strength of government in a democratic Nigeria, but rather the departure from that value which has manifested in the waning strength of government. And I said that I couldn't quite understand it.
Well, I did say that a part of government responsibility is to cater for the people. The people have the constitutional right to live and endeavor in different enterprises in the pursuit of happiness. There's a social contract between the governed and those who are elected to govern. And once you assume the responsibility of governance, you must begin to give back to the community, to the populace, whether it's at the local government level, at the state level, at the federal level. Those expectations, those statutory mandates that devolves on those who are charged with responsibility to govern. If those responsibilities are not being met, and in most cases they're not being met, then the strength of government is being diminished. It applies to security, it applies to institutional structure, it applies to the 3 tiers of government. I'll give you an example. The 774 local governments in this country are not functioning. They have never functioned. We've debated about devolving power, the autonomy of the local government, and it has not become universal where the 774 are functioning, receive their statutory allocations, the officers are elected. There's a clause in the Constitution that says that where the state government, state governors can appoint as an interim measure transitional councils not to exceed 90 days. What happens in most states, the governors appoint transitional councils and renew them every 90 days, and they will run for years and years and years. And the clause was put there that in the event of a force majeure, where it becomes impossible to hold local government elections, that's when the governors are allowed to make such appointments. But now they do it routinely, and nobody's questioned them. Nobody's gone to court to say this will not happen, this ought not to happen. And across the 36 states, that has become the norm.
But you would have thought that things like state legislatures would be holding the governments to account. They're supposed to be a sort of check and balance, aren't they?
Well, the state legislatures, state assemblies are in cahoots with most governors, and that is part of the problem. It is the weakening of the institution. Fundamentally, for any basic political science 101, there are 3 arms of government, separate but equal: the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary. They're supposed to function independently and financed independently. But where you have a state governor controlling the executive arm, controlling resources to the legislative arm, and basically taking ownership of the functions, responsibilities of the local government, you begin to have a situation that we have now. And the structure, the entire structure is weakened, that you no longer have that vibrancy that you ought to have in a democracy. And those are the things we're looking at. Then the other aspect of it, the fundamental, is that the strength of government lies in the soft power approach to governance, not the hard power, not coercion, because coercion belongs to autocracies and military regimes, and we've gone through that. But I suspect that there's still a residual mindset of the many years of military anti-politics.
Yes, I think a lot of people would agree.
And you would see it. I can tell you one aspect of it that you see clearly. I see a democratically elected governor, and he has a policeman or a soldier standing behind him. What is that for? In public. That I can understand, an ADC standing behind a GOC or a military officer, but not. You don't see Queen Elizabeth, you don't see Joe Biden, you don't see the American governors having police orderlies standing behind them. But it becomes the norm here, and it's become the practice. So the system, it's a systemic flaw. But the question is, how do we redress them if we don't redress the mindset of those charged with those responsibilities?
So basically, the institutions of government are serving the interests of a strong man, and the strong man is perceived to be either the governor or the president, rather than the country. So whilst the presidency, for example, bubble gets stronger because of all the things that are coalescing around that president, the rest of the government gets weaker because they depend on the power of the presidency or the governor to sustain them rather than the power of the constitution and of the people.
That's correct. Charles, I'll tell you, it's not even anecdotal. But when I was SSG under Peter Obi, we had a standard practice that we must have reserves to run the government for 3 months, assuming we did not receive a penny from the federal government. 90 days, 3 months. We could pay salaries, we could pay our bills, and then look for alternatives, maybe go into our savings. Most states cannot do that. So basically the states live from paycheck to paycheck, FAC allocation every month. And it induces resignation, it induces laziness in government, it induces all forms of weakness, and people rushing to Abuja every day to find out, to kowtow to the federal government. And what it does is that there's too much power in the center. And that's why some of us insist that there must be devolution. Let's return to the true character of the federal republic, federalism, where the center is weak and the states are the federated units are supposed to run the way they're supposed to run, raise their own revenue, run government, and support the federal governments as required of them.
Right, so that brings me to the question, which is very interesting, about this whole VAT issue. You might have heard me talking to Dr. Sam Amadi earlier. You've seen the news and so on, because you're talking about a fundamental issue that affects restructuring. Do you see this as potentially a kind of groundbreaking case that might force the country to look again at that issue?
You know, we're conflicted in our style of governance, having moved from the parliamentary system to the presidential system. In the United States presidential system, there's nothing called the value-added tax. It does not exist.
Yeah.
So this is something we've borrowed from Britain and the parliamentary system. Now, in the United States, what you have is sales tax, which is strictly the remit of states. And that is analogous to the value-added tax here. But what happens here is that the way it's configured, the value-added tax is collected by the states, remitted to the federal government, and supposedly shared equitably to all the 36 states.
Well, is it actually collected by the states, or is it
collected by the federal government?
FIRS in the states?
In the states.
Right.
And then shared equitably, supposedly, to the federal government, to the states, and the local government. If it had been state taxes, then the states would collect their tax as much as they do and keep it to themselves. But the flip side is this. Those who argue against it, Rivers State for instance, and I'm not opposed to it, I see the merit of the argument, should also remember that when it comes to derivation from oil, the oil producing states get 13%.
Yes.
And the non-oil producing state get less from the oil revenue. So there ought to be a balance there. But the truth of the matter is that I think this ought to go all the way to the Supreme Court. We need to get a test case out of it and for it to be addressed. River State, as it were, is leading the drive, the fight that other states are not willing to fight. But on the balance, it could also be done and restructured in a way that represents that a percentage of the volume of what you collect accrues to you. That would become an incentive for what is collected from your state accrues to you, because the River State does not have the largest population in the Federation. Maybe they do more business, but perhaps not more than Lagos or Kano State or Anambra State. But they do have enterprises that pay more value-added taxes, therefore they collect more. They ought to get a percentage of that, and that's what democracy is all about, where your end right, your dividends of democracy accrue to you, not so much that it's used to service other people who become indolent in their own aspirations and in their own enterprises to collect these things and resign themselves to the fact that at the end of the month they get something from the federal government.
Well, there's an argument from the FIRS, which is the Inland Revenue Service, saying that VAT cannot work on the state level because the mechanisms would not be practical on that level. You worked as a secretary to the government of Anambra State. What do you reckon?
That argument is very defeatist. If a system can work...
It's defeatist.
Yes.
Right, okay.
Yes. If the argument can work at the federal level, if the system is functional at the federal level, why can't it be domesticated at the state level? The modus and the modalities of collection at the state level exist at the state level. So all you have to do is to retrain, and that's where synergy in governance comes in. We will retrain your people, let them do the collection. We won't do it, and then we'll decide how to share it. Right now, you have federal inland revenue in every state.
Well, obviously, if they lose the case, they'll be forced to do that.
Well, and going to court is part of the democracy, and I'm glad it's happening. And I'm glad the River State took that on to get a pronouncement from the court as to what it ought to be.
But do you get the sense that, I mean, you've operated on the state level quite a bit. I mean, do you get the sense that this move by River State has the support of other states? And they're likely to sort of come together to kind of, you know,
it's a matter of who will build the cat.
Right.
Who will build the cat. At the end of the day, they will all be beneficiaries if the case of River State goes all the way to Supreme Court and Supreme Court rules in favor. The remaining 36 states or the remaining states
would have to go along. But in the process leading up to it, obviously the states that don't get that much, they don't generate as much VAT, but are getting more as a result, would be much more inclined to support the FIRS.
What I would have liked to see is like minds within the states that face the same challenge as River State coming and filing a class action suit against the federal government. So there's a broad ownership of the process. That is also one of the weaknesses that you find in government. The interstate collaboration, joint ventures hardly happen. So you get a situation where River State is doing something, the contiguous states, Delta and Anambra State, are doing something similar. And there's no synergy in terms of harmonizing. What is the standard rail? What is... let me give you a part of...
Very briefly, because we have to take a break.
Yes, one of the things I dealt with in the book. Hypothetically, the Rivers, Anambra, Delta light rail system. You build yours, I build mine, we connect three of them. Simple. But it's never contemplated.
But why is that?
Because they have not sat down to say, look, let's get a group to design something we can do as a joint venture. Let's finance it and find a way it can benefit all of us.
Right, okay. Please stay with us. We'd like to talk with you a little bit longer. You're watching the Arise interview. Plenty more still ahead as we continue our chat with the author, politician and former diplomat Oseloka Obaze. Stay with us. Welcome back to the Arise interview. I'm Charles Aniagolu. Now, as the 2023 election approaches, it's a moment of terrible uncertainty for everyone, including the candidates and the electorate. Whilst many remain optimistic that things in Nigeria will improve, particularly the quality of leadership and governance, many others fear or believe that this country could take a turn for the worse. Well, a new book weighs in on the challenges confronting Nigeria in the area of politics policy and governance. After more than 60 years of independence, it argues that the country is still burdened with weak institutions, and this has had profound implications for the country. But there is still a tiny opportunity to turn things around. And the author of the book, Waning Strength of Government, Essays on Nigeria's Governance, Oseloka Obaze, former PDP governorship candidate in Anambra State in the 2017 elections, is still with me in the studio. Thank you very much indeed for staying with us. And looking at your book, I have to say, obviously this is written for people with super brains, because it took me, it was a challenge to actually understand the thrust of it. Obviously there's a lot of value in what you say, but it's just a very difficult read, a very sort of academic, very stodgy read. You could have simplified it, couldn't it, so that more people would understand what you're talking about?
Well, thank you. You could have also said, if it was otherwise, that the book is pedestrian.
No, it's not pedestrian.
And I hope I did not wish for it to be pedestrian.
No, the one thing it isn't is pedestrian.
So the goal was to attempt not to be pedestrian. But the essence for me is this. Long after we are gone, and when the historians talk about the challenges of nationhood, leadership challenges, institutional weaknesses, while we transition from a parliamentary system to a democracy after many years of military rule, what was it that were the core challenges? Who analyzed them? Who spoke about them? And why were the institutions that were so weak not properly addressed? I'll give you an example, something that I find bothersome. The excesses that we have in the conduct of our elections. The elections are managed by academics, from the chairman of the electoral body to the recs, to the officers that conduct the elections. Most of them are PhD holders. What I fail to understand is why anybody who's learned would contribute to the diminution of democracy by their conduct, individually or collectively.
Yeah, but is it them? I know they have some culpability. It's more you politicians.
No, let me finish. Let me finish. Right. I'm a politician. Why would they subject themselves to people who, quote unquote, most of them are more educated and more literate than the rest of us that are politicians, and then turn around to talk to the same politicians and analyze critically that things are not working when you are a core part of that process that has made things not to work? Yeah,
but you're the one writing the book and making the analysis, and you've been a politician, so you answer that question.
But the point is also, first and foremost, I'm a student of politics, and I come from the fact that policies are supposed to work. When they work, they're supposed to be evaluated. If they're evaluated and they don't work, that's when you institute changes. And that's where the elected legislature comes in. You're talking about that. We've talked about, look at how long it took to pass the bill on the petroleum industry. The Electoral Act, the reforms that are needed, they've been drafted, put them through, let the president sign them. And it takes this process. I think, if you ask me, part of it is that without being pedantic, our leaders don't read anymore. So to write a policy brief for somebody who has an agenda and does not want to read why one policy, option A, is better than option B, it's a futile exercise.
So basically you didn't intend them to read it, because not only have you put it in a book, and somebody said that if you want the African not to know what you're talking about, put it in a book, but you've also written it in language that's very difficult for the average person to understand.
Well, the people that read about Nigeria are not Nigerians alone, but I think there's a redemptive value for people, Nigerian observers outside Nigeria, to understand that some of us in Nigeria think critically, think through some of these challenges,
that's a good point.
And are able to say, we know what the challenges are, we can grapple with them.
Right.
We need the political will. But basically what is happening here is that we have two publics in Nigeria. The civic public, that wants to go with the constitution, and the primordial public that wants to go with the basic tenets.
And unfortunately, that primordial public is
dominant.
Makes this, I mean, somebody said they make up 95% of the political class.
Increasingly dominant, and that is why I would challenge anybody who says I would say the federal character is entrenched in the constitution. Why don't you abide by it? And now, if I were to be appointed to a position, and I know that that position ought not to devolve to my state of origin or to my region, I would not accept it. That's personal to me, to make a point. But other people would accept it and justify it, even though you say to him, it violates a particular clause of the Constitution.
And along that thread that you're mentioning now, something that caught my attention in the book as well is that, in a sense, you're calling on people to realize the truth of the challenges facing Nigeria and be unequivocal in their assertion of that truth. But surely everyone knows the problems of Nigeria, and they're spoken about every day. So is that really the issue?
It is, because Charles, I am a fan of this program on Arise, and I've watched every evening as some people sit here and defend the indefensible, and they do it with a straight face, and the rest of us watch them, and perhaps the time has come where you get two people here, the pros and the cons, so that they argue it out, so that our people begin to filter the fact that it is not a one-track tunnel, because some people have the added advantage of being vocal and being able to speak while others don't. And there are a lot of people who are not speaking up because of self-preservation.
Well, we've got about 3 minutes or so. I hope I'm right there. We've got about a couple of minutes before we have to end the chat. But one of the topics that you focus on in the book, and you touched on peripherally a few minutes ago, is on actualizing private sector-led regional investment growth. This suggests greater economic cooperation between states in the different regions, and you've made the point that that is simply not taking place. Do you propose a way forward on that?
Well, I think the substructure is there already. Each geopolitical region has its components of governance, states and their governors. They meet frequently to discuss political issues. What I don't hear them discussing is regional integration. Take the Southeast, for instance, and I'll take something I've written about in one of the one of the chapters. The rail line, national grid, that runs through the Southeast does not go through Anambra and does not go through Imo State. It goes from Ebonyi through Enugu and through Abia into Rivers State. So heavy haulage in the Southeast is by road. Now, if the states were interested, Aba is commercial, Onitsha is commercial, Onitsha happens to be a twin city with Asaba, Enugu is commercial. Nothing stops them from saying, and River State, let's develop a light rail between River State, Delta State, Anambra State, Imo State. That is not federal. Let federal deal with the national grid, the railway, but the light rail for transportation. And this is something you can conceptualize over a 50-year period. But the point is that they want to do everything. It's tied to the 4-year tenure, 8 years tenure maximum. But if you have a grand vision and you're a transformative leader, you should be able to have that plan, put it in place, and let your successor in the respective states inherit this thing and say, in the next 50 years, we have to get this network going.
Well, I'll tell you what, I hope these guys get to read your book, because it's a book that I would recommend. Oseloka Obaze, I want to thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's it for this edition of The Arise Interview. Join us again tomorrow. From me and the entire team here in Abuja, bye-bye, and thank you for watching.